right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have you here today for Columbia Ethics Grand Rounds. I'm Sandra Sujin Lee, a professor of medical humanities and ethics in the Department of Medical Humanities Ethics here at Columbia, and I'm also chief of the Division of Ethics here in Vagelos. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this session, which is entitled All Health Politics is Local. Ethics Grand Rounds is a series organized by our division in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics, really with the goal of engaging our community of health professionals, scholars, and trainees, and scientists across career stages and disciplines by centering important topics and debates in medical ethics that relate to clinical practice, research, implementation, and education. Our hope is that attendees will leave each session with a greater understanding of the ethical and social implications of the topics we discuss. This series is co-led by Lucas Matthews, who is an assistant professor in our division of ethics, and the results is the result of efforts of our organizing committee, which is made up of faculty, affiliated ethics division faculty, research, and program staff. And I really want to thank those individuals for helping to put together our monthly series. For those of you online, please check the chat for logistics and housekeeping information for this session. Just as a reminder, today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded as a resource on the Columbia Division of Ethics website following this event. You will receive a link to this recording along with a list of various resources and references related to today's topic. Via email once it is available. Okay, so now for our focus today, it is really my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Merlin Chowkwanyun, who will discuss their award-winning book, All Health Politics is Local, Community Battles for Medical Care and Environmental Health. Merlin Chowkwanyun is the Donald H. Jemison Assistant Professor of Sociomedical Sciences in the Mailman School of Public Health here at Columbia. They work on four main areas: the history of community health, environmental regulation, social movements around health, and environmental health regulation. They are also the PI of Toxic Docs, an NSF-funded repository of OneSecret documents about toxic substances that have been unearthed from the vaults of corporate archives. So in light of last week's election, not only for the presidency, but also for the Senate and the House, along with regional, local positions, policies, and referendums, I'm really deeply grateful we have Dr. Chowkwanyun today to lead us in a discussion of how what happens locally in our neighborhoods, schools, city council rooms, etc., impacts our ability to create a world in which we want to live. And so without further ado, I welcome Dr. Chowkwanyun to the podium.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out, both people in this room and the people in Zoom world. Before I begin, I just want to thank two important people for helping put this on. First, Sandra Lee for extending the invitation. And then most important, and Sandra, I think you'll understand why I'm saying this person is most important, my former and much smarter and more organized student, Farron Fayweather, for helping with a lot of the preparations as well. Anybody who has had the joy of working with Farron as a teammate, a peer, just knows how attentive she is to detail and getting stuff done. So it's always a joy to work with Farron in any capacity. All right, what I'd like to do in the span of 35 minutes or so is just introduce this new study that Sandra talked about that I've written. Let me see how to click this. There we go. This is the study. And let me start first with the name. All health politics is local. Now, some of you look like you're a little younger for his time, but some of you will know that this is a shameless ripoff of former House Speaker Tip O'Neill, whose heyday was in the 1980s, and his famous quip that all politics is local. And when I was struggling with how to frame this research, I thought about O'Neill, and something just really clicked. Because by his famous line, all politics is local, O'Neill basically meant that the big swings in American life, whether it's changes in views on civil rights, voter and political party realignments, opposition to abortion, all those things don't fundamentally start with the federal Congress or the federal US Supreme Court. Rather, they happen at what the Columbia political scientist Ira Katz-Nelson once famously called the trenches of civic life. That is the block and the neighborhood. And then they bubble up. And Sandra made a reference to the election. I think O'Neill's insight could not be more appropriate than now for understanding the direction of politics in this country at the national level and where it fundamentally comes from. O'Neill's insight about localism struck me as one that made a lot of sense, in particular for public health. Now, most public health research of the sort that my colleagues and frankly myself do, it prizes this thing called generalizability. And yes, it is very important for social research to be much more than a stack of case studies about this place or that place. It's true. But I think this quest for generalizability can also bleed out, erase the local and grounded context that I think, and that Tip O'Neill certainly thought was and is hugely important. And so that's what I'm trying to restore in this project. Now, before I say a little bit more about that, I thought I could first put the locales that I studied on the board really quickly, and here they are. There are 4 regions in this book: New York City, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and Central Appalachia. And in each of these regions, I either have a medical care case or an environmental health case. So we'll get into these cases in just a second, but I wanted to step back a bit and talk briefly about some of the conceptual goals I had with this book before we dive into more concrete stuff. I mentioned just a moment ago the myopia of generalizability. And one of my goals here is analytic reorientation. I wanted to restore, in accounts of health politics, local social topography, political machines, neighborhood organizations, racial politics, urban development, grassroots political mobilization, political economic shifts, and exogenous and highly consequential events specific to a particular area. And you'll see a lot of these things very shortly. I want you, in other words, to think about health less in terms of this and more in terms of that. A corollary goal that I have too is to also treat localism itself not just as an optic and a category of analysis, but also as an actual mode of on-the-ground political practice for improving the public's health. So I argue that in the United States, the embrace of the local by those concerned with health was a very strong impulse, and it shot really strongly through the immediate decades after World War II. All kinds of local medical care and environmental health endeavors flourished. It was the age of the local. And yet this embrace of the local in health, however vibrant, was a historical moment unto itself. And I argue it was a moment that petered out by the early 1980s. By the last 2 decades of the 20th century, localist proponents in health bumped up against growing supralocal and structural constrictions to enacting that local strategy. Now, if all that feels like a hunk of abstraction, don't worry, because that's how it feels to me. What I'm going to do is graph what I've been talking about, graft what I'm going to talk about onto more concrete case material. So let me do that by starting with the medical care cases in Cleveland and Los Angeles. And I picked them because both of these cities had some of the most severe racial uprisings or riots in the 1960s. One in Los Angeles's Watts neighborhood in 1965, and one in Cleveland's Huff neighborhood in 1966. Huff is like tough, but spelled with an H. One of the most fascinating things I discovered writing this book was the impact of the riots in catalyzing healthcare infrastructure. So in Los Angeles, after the riot, this panicky official commission tried to find out why people were so angry. And the commission wrote this report, and they actually had a whole section in that report on healthcare deprivation. And this report noted that in Watts, in the south central area of Los Angeles where this occurred, the physician to population ratio was something like half of that for the entire county, basically a medical desert. And the few facilities that did exist, they were typically for-profit hospitals. They were really predatory and run down with a lot of vermin and rat droppings and other kinds of indications of disrepair. Watts is where most of the Black population in Los Angeles lived due to pervasive housing segregation. And you see that on this map there. The redder shades mean that 50% of that particular census tract is Black. And you can see with the boundary that most of those census tracts were in Watts. But after the riots in 1965, officials realized they had to do something. And so they promised a full-service hospital for this area. And it was intended to be a full-service hospital for the people of Watts, and it was also going to be run by the people of Watts. Now in Cleveland, you have something slightly different. So as in Los Angeles, there's also an uneven distribution of medical resources, but of a different kind. So in LA, the problem is the absence of healthcare infrastructure. In the Huff neighborhood in Cleveland, though, you have a ton of healthcare infrastructure, but no access to it unless you are affluent. And I focus in particular on the Cleveland Clinic, located on the east side of Cleveland, the site of the Huff neighborhood where the Cleveland riot took place. Now, as most of us know, this Cleveland Clinic name is rather deceptive. This is not some quaint, cute little clinic. From the 1920s to the 1960s, it developed into one of the most prestigious elite medical centers in the world. 2/3 of its clientele came from outside the county where Cleveland is and what is located. And yet, the Cleveland Clinic was just a profound geographic contradiction because it was located on this east side area, one of the most segregated and resource-deprived neighborhoods in the country, not unlike Watts. You can see the location here, smack dab in the middle of one of the most hyper-segregated neighborhoods in the country. But not only did the Cleveland Clinic not do anything for its low-income African-American neighbors, it also constantly expanded. And I know of no better way to show this than these two aerial photographs. These are two aerial shots that show the expansion over just a couple decades. So on the left, you have the 1930s, and on the right, you have the 1950s. And you can see that there are homes on the left, and then those homes are gone on the right. And just a side note, the Cleveland Clinic would not actually let me publish these in my book. So if you're on Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, have at it. In the 1960s, they were actually going to continue expanding even more. They had a vision for this kind of 30-block science center in this part of Cleveland. But the riots dramatically changed everything. They put a stop to that. And the Cleveland Clinic executives really worried. They wondered if people would come and torch the clinic next. And just to give you a sense of how scared the riots made them, I'm going to read you some of the deliberations that the clinic had the moment after the Huff riot in 1966. So these are Cleveland Clinic officials kind of gathered in a boardroom, and they're wondering what to do. So one official wondered openly whether the area was, quote unquote, on collision course with another Watts. All the ingredients are present. Fuse is set. Despair, cynicism, antagonism are abundantly present. And fear reached a high enough level that the clinic actually thought it might move, just pick up and get out of Cleveland altogether. But then it also thought about crafting elaborate militaristic emergency plans in the event of another riot. And these elaborate plans would include the formation of its own private paramilitary force, what it called squad leaders, who would be composed of men with previous combat experience. These executives discussed the use of weaponry that would include tear gas, riot guns, and in the worst case scenario, what they called ultimate weapons, which would include firearms, pistols, and rifles to be aimed at anybody who managed to enter a Cleveland Clinic building. Now, one Cleveland Clinic official did wonder aloud whether such elaborate defenses were going to be necessary. He argued that if the National Guard failed to contain the rioters, there would be little choice but to, quote unquote, turn the property over to the mob. And then this official continued, suppose a mob stormed this place. What would it be likely to do once it got in? Probably try to find narcotics and food. But it is hard for me to believe that these people would harm patients or unresisting personnel. They would only hurt their own cause and bring total, lasting retribution onto their own heads. But behind all this racialized, and I would say racist, language of mobs and militants, weapons, and paramilitary forces was also a begrudging admission that, to quote one clinic executive, quote, the rioters' attitude is that conditions are intolerable. They are anxious, he continued, to precipitate changes in the social system which they feel holds them in bondage. And so, like the officials in Los Angeles, the Cleveland Clinic officials pledged to build more healthcare infrastructure in this area. And in this case, it would be a primary care clinic on this east side of Cleveland. Now, both of these, I argue, were actually half victories. It took a long time for the Los Angeles hospital to finally open, almost a decade. And when it did in 1972, California and the country were now mired in recession, a big contrast from the 1960s. And the new hospital was plagued by a lot of patient care scandals. And this was partially because Los Angeles actually ended up routing a lot of patients from elsewhere in the county into this hospital that was intended for the people of Watts. So this new hospital opens, and then the county decides to just kind of move all of these patients that are outside of Watts into this hospital. So it puts a lot of extra pressure on the hospital, all in this kind of budget-cutting, recessionary climate. Fast forward a few decades, authorities in 2007 actually ordered the hospital to be shut down following a rash of medical malpractice complaints. Throughout the decades, critics of this hospital, which was called Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital, they tended to frame King almost exclusively as this case study in administrative mismanagement and dysfunction. But in the end, that myopic focus on mismanagement alone, it kind of treated King as if it were this institution unconstrained by multiple external factors. Instead, King had the misfortune of being a local institution that opened in very harsh economic circumstances that never quite let up, preventing it from ever achieving the institutional stability of its peers. In Cleveland, it was less a fiscal issue than one of dissipating political energy. So in 1976, a full decade after the Huff riot, this East Side Healthcare Center that it promised finally did open. But by that point, a decade later, a lot of the energy that was unleashed by the 1966 Cleveland riot had disappeared. And so the clinic was back to its old games. It started to expand again. And this was also part of a new kind of growth imperative that was pushed by a lot of local Cleveland city development associations. But the clinic was now much more wise this time. It started to expand on the opposite side of town, eastward. And eastward was site of an entertainment complex owned by a Black entrepreneur, Winston Willis, who presided over a constellation of bars and nightclubs, all while antagonizing the clinic with obscene billboards that derided it as a racist institution. This is one of my favorite people I've ever studied. He loved spelling Cleveland Clinic with a KKK in front of clinic. But at this point, you know, the clinic just wasn't really that worried or concerned about Willis or people like him or collective political reaction on the streets. Very stark contrast to the case just a decade before. The clinic also did not actually commit as many resources as it promised to the new East Side Health Center. It mainly kicked in a modest sum of money, but now it was actually the county government that ended up putting in much more of the work and resources. And so, more than a decade after the Huff riot in 1980, Senator Howard Metzenbaum, a liberal Ohio Democrat, characterized the clinic rather bluntly. The senator said, quote, "They are extremely well off financially, and I've been told by the former director they are unquestionably one of the most profit-making operations of any hospital in the country. And yet they share no responsibility." So these are two stories, these are two examples of how localism can be very powerful. A local political jolt in the form of a riot, a response to long-standing racial exclusion in these two cities, extracted some very real medical concessions. But those were concessions with very real limits. In Los Angeles, it comes in the form of a new economic turbulence and fiscal stringency that hampered the new hospital. And in Cleveland, yes, it's a nice new outpatient health center, but it was only a drop in the bucket in a city where there remained a lot of medical exclusion, especially in that East Side Cleveland neighborhood. All right, let me move on to my next cases. So my two environmental health cases are in my hometown of Los Angeles in Central Appalachia. And by Central Appalachia, I mostly mean Eastern Kentucky and a little chunk of Eastern Tennessee and West Virginia, but mostly Eastern Kentucky. And it's kind of a dyadic puzzle. And the puzzle is a pretty simple one. It goes like this. Why was environmental health mitigation so successful in Los Angeles and pretty much a failure in Central Appalachia? Now, in Los Angeles, I want to take you to the 1940s and 1950s and tell the story of smog. Now, I'm from Los Angeles, and when people from Los Angeles hear this talk and they hear me say successful environmental mitigation in Los Angeles, they're like, what are you talking about? Like the wisecrack that I always heard growing up from my Northern California residents, relatives, or people in Seattle, and stuff was Los Angeles is so polluted, but it's nothing these days. Even on the worst days of Los Angeles, it's nothing compared to the 1940s and 1950s. Back then, there were days when the entire skyscape would be dark. This was called a daylight dim out, and this was a regular sort of occurrence. Now, local topography and ecological distinctiveness is critical to how things play out in Los Angeles. So air pollution is not unique to Los Angeles. It is a phenomenon anywhere you have emissions or industrial sites. But in Los Angeles, it has this particularly pronounced quality because of where Los Angeles is. It's by the ocean and it's by mountains, as you see right here. And so what the oceans do is they create a current, and it pushes emissions, pollution towards mountains. And then the mountains are a barrier that bounces the pollution back. You can kind of see it here. And on certain days with certain temperatures, it forms what is called an inversion layer that traps the pollution underneath. So you have this pollution circulating between ocean and mountain. Then you have this inversion layer, which is kind of like a blanket metaphorically. And that's how you get smog. It's like kind of trapped in there and it concentrates. And this is very unique to Los Angeles, and again, is an example of where local particularity matters. Local particularity also matters in Central Appalachia. So this is where most of the bituminous coal in the United States was located. Bituminous coal. Bituminous coal is the second highest grade of coal there was, and it was beginning to predominate for electricity generation around the 1950s and the 1960s. And it's not only that coal is in the Central Appalachian region, but also ever disruptive and intensive methods for extracting this coal with heavy-duty machinery were also coming into existence, namely something called strip mining. Strip mining. So this is a very ecologically destructive and highly mechanized form of mining on the Earth's surface. Mechanically, it's a multi-part process that involves first devegetation, then deforestation, and then these cranes come through and they remove huge chunks of land. And then you have a bulldozer like the one pictured here that comes through and smooths out and clears out a space, and then hauling of coal can begin. And strip mining accelerated dramatically, as you can see in these two graphs, showing its spread over a 20-year period from 1955 to 1975. So these two, not graphs, maps, these two maps. So this is 1955. The redder shades mean that there is more strip mining going on. So here's 1955. Here's 1975. By 1975, strip mining is the #1 way you get coal, this kind of special bituminous high-grade coal. And it poses considerable health risks for people who live around mining sites, especially in the form of mudslides and flooding and water pollution. There are all sorts of metals that get into people's drinking water. And so my puzzle was to step back, look at these two environmental health problems, each inextricably shaped by local context, and then also consider how that local context affected the politics of it. And again, in Los Angeles, environmental mitigation was a success. In Central Appalachia, it was not. One of the reasons I give for Los Angeles' success is that Los Angeles County implemented a pretty no-nonsense emission control campaign, even when the science about what caused smog wasn't fully formed. So Los Angeles, right away, they created an air pollution control agency that set strict curbs on a number of compounds that it suspected might contribute to smog. It was aggressive, preemptive action aimed very squarely at Los Angeles industrial capitalists, steel companies, oil and gas, manufacturing. These officials, they didn't wait for the exact science about what smog was and what its human effects, health effects were. No, they started acting right away. If there was an industrial compound somewhere in the air, soon enough, there was an emissions cap for it. So it was a cast a wide net approach. Preemptively, just get as much gunk out of the air as possible. So how does this happen? Well, first, I argue that it's local foment and protest. A lot of angry, mad residents are inundating the county, and they're putting up kind of polemical, angry posters like this. And they're pretty livid. And that moves many elected officials. And one thing that's very interesting is that these residents, they come from all over Los Angeles, from very Tony rich suburbs to industrial cores. And the officials then tend to cast air pollution as this kind of universal, countywide, collective, we're all in this together community endeavor, rather than something that is just affecting one specific population living in one specific place. So it really kind of creates a county-wide unity. Everyone is angry about smog in Los Angeles County. But it's not just residents. So Los Angeles County itself, the government, also exploited internal tensions between capitalists within Los Angeles. So industrial capitalists were one very important core part of Los Angeles. Yes, the steel industry, various manufacturing, etc., oil and gas, absolutely, hugely important. But there was another capitalist faction that was hugely important, particularly in Los Angeles, and that's the real estate, hospitality, and entertainment sector. So one of Los Angeles County's most powerful officials, this county supervisor named John Anson Ford, he said this, quote, "We recognize too that our tourist industry is in very real jeopardy, and that the attractions of our distinctive climate, of our seashore, of our mountains, each of priceless worth to all Californians, are at times completely obliterated by this unforeseen byproduct of wartime and post-war development." So a poor physical climate, in other words, was bad for the fiscal monetary climate. And there are a lot of other coalitions like that too, but smog is really a unifying issue that eventually backs the industrial capitalist faction into a corner. And surprising to me, they ultimately did not resist strong regulation of the sort that I described. There are just so many different kind of factions within the kind of capitalist class that oppose this and that have kind of business reasons for opposing smog, that the industrial capitalists say, okay, fine. And they mostly comply with these strong regulations. Still, this was not by any means an unqualified success. Los Angeles was ultimately still committed to rapid economic growth in the 1950s. So even though the county was able to bring down emissions of a particular individual industrial site, the number of industrial sites kept expanding. So you can reduce emissions of something that you think contributes to smog by, say, 25% or 50%. But if you double the amount of facilities, you basically canceled out that reduction. And that's what happens in Los Angeles in the 1950s during this boom growth economic era. What's the one word you think about when you think about California and specifically Los Angeles in the 1950s? Boom! California is still, and Los Angeles in particular, is still very much committed to boom and economic boom. The same thing goes for automobiles, especially with rapid federally subsidized construction of these things called freeways, which bring in vehicles from outside Los Angeles, including vehicles that were not subject to some of the new Los Angeles regulations. So there's eventually this epiphany, this realization that you can't just limit air pollution control in just one place, however robust those regulations are. And the car really symbolizes that limitation. Now, in Central Appalachia, it's the opposite story. Now, as in Los Angeles, there is also vigorous local protest. This is a local newspaper here that is publishing articles about mudslides that this strip mining is causing. But I argue the process ultimately is not reversed in Central Appalachia. In Central Appalachia, the residents have no elite allies at all. It's a much less diversified economy, so you can't play off factions against each other as happened in Los Angeles. There's much more of a one-crop economy in this region, namely energy. And Appalachian politicians themselves were also very heavily influenced by coal companies, and some actually used to work for coal companies, very much a revolving door kind of effect. This is just 2 pages of something called the Kentucky Coal Policy Council, which set regulatory policy around coal. And if you kind of squint a bit there, you can see they're all coal executives setting coal policy and pollution policy for this region. But it's also not just kind of state level regulatory capture. I mean, that's part of the story, but it's other forces as well. And I think the biggest force is actually the increasing centrality of coal to the nation's energy infrastructure by the 1960s. And I don't know actually a better way to capture this than with this ad from 1964. So back in the days when we had physical newspapers, sometimes advertisers would pay for an advertisement that looked like an actual article. It would be laid out just like an actual article, and then you'd read it and it'd smell funny and you go, ah, they got me. It's an ad, not a real article. Well, this is one of those things. And this ad here foreshadowed the position that the industry, the coal industry, and also later politicians would push on coal. It's emphasizing the indispensability of coal to the American economy, the way of life. And it's conveyed here through these scenes of suburban domesticity, undergirded by this phrase, the invisible power of coal. Coal is central to your life. That is the message of this ad. And American policymakers largely accepted these terms. And that was especially the case in the 1970s. 1970s, where there were 2 sudden oil shortages in the United States, which accelerated political calls for drastically reducing dependence on foreign sources of energy. And coal, mined within the United States, seemed like the answer. The title here of Democratic President Jimmy Carter's Commission on Coal suggests as much. And so, when you combine local regulatory capture and cronyism with a national energy imperative in which huge swaths of the country are participants, the deck is overwhelmingly stacked against Appalachian people living in this region. All right, in my last set of cases, I examined disputes around who should govern, who should have a say in how healthcare facilities are run. And I'm going to focus in particular on Los Angeles right here. But before I do that, let me just back up for some brief exposition. So in the 1960s, there was this new federal agency created called the Office of Economic Opportunity, OREO without an R, OEO. And it created something called the Neighborhood Health Centers Program, which is actually still around. I know a number of you work in neighborhood health centers or have used them or are doing internships there. Neighborhood Health Centers Program comes out of this office, this initiative in the 1960s, OEO. And the goal of neighborhood health centers was to bring low cost and sometimes free care for poor people into neighborhoods in need of those healthcare services. So they built one of these neighborhood health centers in Watts, that same neighborhood in Los Angeles that I was discussing at the start of the talk. It wasn't a full hospital, but it did offer inpatient and outpatient services, and it was funded to the tune of $2.4 million. And that's a lot in 1960s dollars. So this is a big investment in Watts by the federal government and OEO. But this thing wasn't going to be just about filling enormous gaps in healthcare services. There was also a very important social component to it. It would hire local residents as employees, and these local residents would canvass Watts and inform other residents that the center existed. And these health teams would also help residents navigate adjacent social service agencies in the neighborhood that dealt with job training, housing, and education. And the idea was also to use these residents as sentinels so that, they could kind of ascertain what the health needs, what the social needs of Watts were, and bring it back to the people running the health center. So there was a lot of optimism surrounding the opening of the center. It was kicked off by an appearance from the OEO head, Sergeant Shriver, who is the broadcaster Maria Shriver's dad. But this celebratory mood that you see here in the photo, it soon started to subside, and it gave way to very pitched conflicts around who was actually going to call the shots, who was actually going to make the decisions in how this new center for the people of Watts actually operated. And to understand that conflict, there's an organizational structure that you have to understand. It's a little confusing, so I'm going to diagram it here. Now, in this era, when OEO, when the federal government funded these kind of community local programs, they delegated institutional middlemen to actually dole out the dollars. And so here you see a schematic of this. So there's federal money, but it doesn't go directly to the new local project. You have to have a kind of intermediary in the middle, that a quote unquote responsible intermediary that actually gets the money and actually oversees the operation of the project. And here it was the University of Southern California, or USC, that actually received government funds for the project. So they're the recipient institution, and they're the ones who actually get to run the project. Now, this was a very fraught decision. In the past couple of decades, USC have been rapidly expanding several miles directly north of Watts, displacing many Black residents in the process. And there was this guy named Jim Bates, and he was hired as a community organizer for this new Watts Health Center. Very interesting guy. He was a Black alumnus of USC. He had played football there. He had, he kind of had a good sense of USC's bad relationship with its neighbors. And he loved to write kind of memos and diaries about this experience and setting up this new center. And so in a memo, he summarized the sentiments, the feelings of Watts residents rather pithily and bluntly as follows, quote, "We just don't want the University of Southern California in Watts under any circumstances." And USC felt that suspicion early on. All three of the hand-picked administrators from USC for the Watts Center were white. And there was also larger animosity from independent Black physicians in Watts who saw this new project as a threat. And that kind of intra-racial tension within the Black population also fed into another governance struggle. So as the center's paid organizer, that fellow whose quote I just read to you a moment ago, Jim Bates, he had this really thankless task. He had to form a community health council. So this was another fascinating mandatory feature of the new stream of federal funding coming out of that OEO or agency. And what it did was it required organizations getting this new federal money to create a community board, a neighborhood community board of non-physician lay people. And this was designed to assure that bottom-up community input would be felt in major administrative decisions. It was called the maximum feasible participation rule. It said you have to have maximum feasible participation of non-professional, non-physician lay people, everyday people, community people. And so Bates is in charge of creating this council, and he struggles with it for a very long time. He's like, how do I create a board that represents something called the community? He's been in Watts for a long time, and he's like, this is actually a very complex community with a lot of differences, internal tensions, etc. How do I create this board? And this is what he does. So in the end, he came up with this blunt tool to enacting this community board. And he called it a membership determining funnel. So he had a formula that scored prospective council members' responses in interviews, and then he whittled them down to where they lived in Watts, and their age and education level. And in his mind, this was a crude and very blunt, but also a very necessary step towards creating something that might be representative of a thing called community. And so the first council that he assembled was all Black. It contained 17 members, 9 women, 8 men, 6 of whom possessed some level of higher education and kind of spread out throughout the Watts neighborhood. And to Bates and this center's credit, after some of those initial growing pains, the Watts Health Center actually started to see some real success. I think credit for that harmony went to the early work of people like Jim Bates and also the talents of a fellow named Rodney Powell. So he was a Black physician from Philadelphia. He had spent the better part of the decade in the Peace Corps, and then he was asked to join this project because there was so much fighting with the USC people. So he was asked to join, and he works very hard to kind of clarify how he's going to share power with the newly formed Community Health Council. A lot of the early bureaucratic squabbles with USC had compromised actual delivery of quality service. And so what Powell did was he said, let's stop fighting. And he said, we're going to streamline the structure of this center and have this community board act more like a board of directors. So you're going to set broad goals for the center. You're going to have a final say on major program operations, including who directs the center. But why don't you leave the day-to-day operations to myself and the medical staff? And until the 1980s, when it hit fiscal trouble, this Watts Health Center actually experienced, again, about 15 years of very fruitful operation, and also, most important, full autonomy. Full autonomy. USC eventually phased itself out of the project entirely. In studying the positive resolution to these community battles in Los Angeles, there were so many times where I wished I was an ethnographer, like an anthropologist, who could kind of transport myself into time and just watch this thing. I really got a sense of the enormous interpersonal skills and sensitivity that people like Rodney Powell and Jim Bates possessed, that allowed projects like this Watts Health Center to navigate very tense and sometimes very racialized battles over governance. One-to-one people skills are kind of a thing that, whatever your brand of research or social science, it's often very hard to operationalize and measure. But it's really, I think, what allowed these two fellows to kind of cool down the tension and the temperature. I'm looking very forward to your remarks, so let me just close by turning back to the title of this book right here. Now, at first glance, you can see this title, and you can easily conclude this is another rah-rah local grassroots is awesome book, celebrating grassroots bottom-up movements over anything else. And there's certainly some of that here. That is actually where my heart and emotion lies. But this book is not romanticism at all. The local strategy, as I argued, it petered out by the 1980s. Merely surviving budget cuts and fiscal crises in Los Angeles became a big problem, as I said, for the new Los Angeles hospital. The industrial growth imperative ultimately limited how successful Los Angeles alone could be when it came to controlling emissions. The national energy infrastructure entrenched easy access to coal in central Appalachia at the expense of the bodily welfare and health and safety of those who live there. And even some of the successes, the Cleveland and Los Angeles health centers, concessions after the riots, those were ultimately hyper-local single-center projects that weren't sufficient for the cumulative health needs of those neighborhoods. I think grappling with localism is even more complicated today. In the medical care sector, you've seen a lot of mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations, which will continue. It all makes kind of the little community battles in medical care that I wrote about, one hospital here, one neighborhood health center there. It all seems a little quaint. And ditto, the same for the environment with climate change, where even one locality, one state, even one country's ideal climate policy is not going to be enough in an interconnected world. And yet, I don't think you throw out the local either. So just to take climate change, just to stay on it for a second, you all remember that moment 4+ years ago when the United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which it is almost certain to do again. It was actually local US mayors, local officials who were the most proactive in trying to keep something resembling a climate target together. And they're probably going to have to do that again. And so I end up arguing in this book that we should pursue what I call a multi-scalar health politics. It would preserve and prize the value of localism, but it would also recognize and act on a multiplicity of vectors within, but also beyond the local. So it's basically keeping an eye on multiple levels of influence, even if the local strategy is the one you ultimately enact. And I think that local strategy remains necessary because whatever the limits of localism, I think it will continue to endure. And the reason I think it will continue to endure to me and to others is because it has a fundamental accessibility and democratic promise. For most people, one's backyard, the local, is the most tangible, reachable, and most importantly, changeable thing in their lives, as opposed to elite institutions far away or large-scale global processes that remain very abstract. And in a very unequal society like ours, where most people have little other means, it is to their immediate environs where people often head when they first consider stretching the horizon of what is possible and when they need to fend off impending threats to their welfare, whether in health or otherwise. And with that, I'm happy to talk on Zoom and in person. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So we do have a very large group on Zoom, so I want to make sure we get to their questions. But I'm going to start us off, and while you all are thinking about your questions, and really want to take up what you just and maybe if you could,
stand
you could come up here so I can see you.
Yeah.
So your work so beautifully and I think compellingly details the role of local politics, of course, on health outcomes and the danger of a one-size-fits-all approach to health policies. I'm wondering if you can, we're in our current political context. We've just had an election. As a historian, I'm wondering if you could draw on your study and expand in terms of thinking about what are the learnings for politically divided local communities that may be resistant to state and federal policies dictating local health priorities. But I'm thinking about this kind of unit of analysis of the community. What is a community? And particularly in our current context, when those communities are actually fractured politically, what does this mean in terms of moving the local agenda forward? What is that?
Yeah, no. This is a great question about the word community and just localism in the current context. So I think there's a couple questions in there. I'll start with community. I think everybody, no matter what your political inclination is, needs to be much more precise about what you mean by community. I feel this with people who are my ideological brethren, and I feel this with people who whose views I oppose. But everybody is always kind of invoking community as this sort of thing that's there and obviously has this kind of unitary feeling and sentiment, and that's just not true. And the way you pierce an imagined community versus a real set of people who commonly express concern is you go to this local level. So rather than invoking, quote unquote, as we've seen in the press a lot, the quote unquote Latino community or the Asian community or whatever, and how supposedly they all vote in PACs, which is just nonsense to me. You actually have to go into local localities and actually see that there are local circumstances which shape people's lives and worldviews, etc. So I think that's the first thing, and that dovetails into my second comment. There's been a lot of I think pretty unscientific, sloppy inference made from snap exit polls with samples of like 500 and 1,000 in the past week about how supposed unitary racial voting blocks voted, or even if you're not talking about racial voting blocks, how quote unquote the American people voted. And I think actually the Tip O'Neill approach is much more edifying than that kind of stuff you see in punditry, because I think, you know, someone in East Palestine, Ohio, where that kind of train accident occurred and all this vinyl chloride stuff went in the air, I think those people probably have a very different reason why they voted one way or the other than people in New York, than people in Baton Rouge, than people in Omaha, Nebraska. So I think it's much more useful to look at people's kind of local context as much as possible if you're thinking about one, the prospects for political change, why people vote the way they do, etc. I'll say one more thing about this. I lived for about 6 months in Eastern Kentucky, kind of doing this research. And while I had some, days off when I wasn't doing the research, I would kind of just walk around and talk to people and stuff. And one of the most interesting things about the Appalachian area is, everybody writes it off these days. Red state, super conservative, super backwards, where Mitch McConnell is from, etc. And I can't stand that. Like, there was once an era where people where there were Democratic senators like Robert Byrd and Rockefeller, who were actually pretty good on environmental conservation issues. They weren't great on the coal issue, but they were good on other issues. And they came out of this region. And so the one question you might ask is, what happened? That blue senators can no longer win in this region. I think it has a lot to do with what the coal economy has done to employment prospects and also people's just general well-being. And that kind of specificity is what I'd like to see, more than just writing off this state as a quote unquote red state where just a bunch of kind of primitive people live. It's deeply insulting to people who live there, and especially is not mindful of what they have had to go through. I have a lot of I have a lot of differences with people in that in that area, but I also have a lot of empathy for the kind of ecological destruction that area has faced. So those are kind of my initial thoughts.
Okay, and I know we're at the top of the hour, but I do want to take this one question from Cheryl Kunis online, who asks, on a local level, do you believe we will be able to preserve local health programs, especially Medicaid related, that the federal government will most likely try to eliminate with federal laws and cutbacks? I think it's getting, again, at this tension.
Yeah, I mean, I have a kind of technical political scientist sort of answer to this. I mean, one of the virtues and drawbacks of Medicaid is that it has this funky, what we call federalist structure. It's not a pure federal program. It's not a pure state program. It's kind of this weird program that the state partially subsidizes and it's matched by the federal government. That can actually be awesome in a time like this because you're not 100% reliant on the federal government. I think the same for a lot of public health stuff. A lot of public health stuff actually we saw in COVID is not really fundamentally federal. It's state and local. So actually, I think local officials who want to test kind of the boundaries of federalism, I think we're going to see a lot of that. So I think that's one positive read on federalism. The negative read on federalism is that, there have been a series of Supreme Court decisions and patterns in use of executive authority that are really kind of designed to supersede state and local power and preemptive. So there is a kind of a clash over what federalism means and how it will look in the United States in the coming years. But I actually think this could be one thing that is a good thing about our often wacky federalist structure in the United States.
So I imagine people in the room have questions, but for the session, I'm going to formally close it out. But fortunately, we have Merlin has agreed to stay for another half hour. So those of you in the room who would like to continue the conversation, please do stay with us. And we will keep the Zoom room open for that period in case there are folks on Zoom who would like to ask questions. And I just wanted to formally thank Dr. Chowkwanyun for a wonderful presentation and for the questions we've heard thus far. The recording will be posted on the Columbia Division of Ethics website. Want you to know that on December 10th, we will have our next Ethics Grand Rounds, which will be on the ethics of psychedelics. We will be joined by Dr. Amy McGuire, who's director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. And you can see here the QR code on the screen to register for that session. And then finally, we do take your comments and feedback seriously. So please, if you could just spend a couple of minutes to fill out the survey, that would be great. But let's continue the conversation for those of you who can remain with us. And let me just open it up to others in the room or online who would like to ask questions. Yeah. So Alexis, do we have a microphone just to keep folks in the Zoom room? So I think Alexis has a question.
Thanks so much for your talk. Really great to hear you. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the problems of physical expansion of medical centers, like you were talking about with the Cleveland Clinic. You know, people sometimes say things like, "Well, can't we just build more housing?" Which I have some background on, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But I also wondered, if possible, it's a little bit outside of your research, so if not, just let me know. But if you could link it to how we ought to think about Columbia's role in Upper Manhattan. Certainly, currently we talk a lot about community engagement, et cetera, but we also continue to physically expand. And yeah, I wondered if you could speak to that.
No, thank you. I'm happy to talk about it without getting fired. No, in all seriousness, though, the physical expansion story, there's not a lot of good to report before the 1980s. There's a fascinating project that's done by the University of Richmond where you can type in any single locality and you can see urban renewal reports, many urban renewal projects, many of which were propelled by universities and medical centers. And they actually have counts there of the number of people who were displaced. And it really puts, even though it's just counts, it really gives a human dimension to the costs of campus expansion and medical expansion. So my initial thought is, as a historian, I think we should confront that history and excavate it. It is incredibly hard. I mean, speaking of ethics, there's an ethics of discovery, of history, of archives here. It is incredibly hard actually to do research on health centers. Health centers are incredibly, I don't want to be too blanket about it, but they can sometimes be incredibly secretive. And I don't understand why. Like my experience with the Cleveland Clinic is just one example of it. The thing I always tell them is that the people who are responsible for this are dead. So we're not implicating anybody now. And if you don't want constant headbutting and clashing with the community, I think the first thing you got to do is just do kind of a truth and reconciliation sort of project. Who was harmed? What kind of restitution might be done for that, etc. I've thought a little bit about this in a kind of reparations sort of framework. I'm not sure exactly if that's the right one, but you know, step one of any kind of reparations, restitution, restorative justice, so compensatory justice sort of framework is just what happened, what happened and who did it. I will say Columbia is actually excellent with archives. My former student, Abby Sussel, wrote a brilliant thesis where she researched the history of the medical center's relationship with Washington Heights. To your second question, Alexis, about Columbia's relationship. And what she found basically was this. Over and over again, the university would do something that would anger the community, and then they would realize why they had angered the community, and then they would pull back. So one of the things that they did was they actually wanted to demolish or drastically reconstruct the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm X was assassinated. That is just not something you do. Just because of the importance of Malcolm X to people in Upper Manhattan. And so they were kind of shocked when, you know, the community, when people in Washington Heights were mad and Harlem were mad about that. And they eventually backed off of that. But what ended up happening was that she found that every kind of 25 years, there would be another incident. And it would be like nobody in the medical center had ever anticipated this or knew about it. They were kind of caught by surprise. Like when I was reading the thesis, I said, this is like the cartoon character, Mr. Magoo, and he's just kind of stepping on a rake over and over again. And I think history actually really helps with that, right? Because if you knew a little history about the tense relationships, not just between Columbia and its surrounding neighborhood, but universities and medical centers, in general, I think you're less liable to do stuff like that. So I think it's very much a reason to take history and the history of our institutions more seriously. But two, it doesn't have to be, you know, the PR paranoia of some of the people who are in charge of this stuff, I think is so unfounded. It doesn't have to be like this guilt trippy thing that's designed to make people feel bad. As I said, bulk of the decisions were made a long time ago. And I think it's actually a way for the university to better, more positively interact with its community by bringing the history to the surface and kind of cooperatively analyzing it together. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So a commitment to transparency and excavation, but the other part in terms of reconciliation, what does that mean in terms of ongoing accountability? Yeah, so those are very important. Lucas, you have a question? Yeah.
Hi, Lucas here. Merlin, thank you so much for such a rich talk. The historical examples are such a vivid way of offering your contribution. And your discussion of the inversion in Los Angeles County reminded me of grad school. I went to the University of Utah, and every winter, Salt Lake City has an inversion. And every winter, everybody complains that pollution is terrible. And every winter, the older folks tell you, well, you should have been here in the 80s. You wouldn't walk around without having soot all over you. Right. And there's a similar story about how the inversion was terrible. The community complained about it, and they improved the situation. And so it makes me curious about how there are examples of local situations where there's a change. And I'm curious if maybe it has more to do with the problem, the nature of the environmental issues, such as inversion and its resolvability, as opposed to just being a local phenomenon.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, Lucas. I think that's absolutely right. Like it's not only the particular manifestation of smog, but in comparing those two regions, it's the nature of the problem. The one thing about smog is it affects everybody. It affects people unequally. And that's another limit that I didn't talk about, but one limit of the Los Angeles Air Pollution Control Program was in embracing this rhetoric of universality, that this is this is a problem that affects all of us as a community, whether or not you live in Watts or Beverly Hills or Pasadena or, you know, the central city of Los Angeles affects us all. One problem with that is that it elides, of course, inequalities within Los Angeles in terms of pollution, burden, and so forth. But putting that aside temporarily for just a second, yes, smog problem involves everybody in Los Angeles, whereas as you I think are hinting at in Appalachia, it's people who live next to mining communities. And, you know, if you don't live next to a mining community, that kind of self-interest that might propel you to support mitigation or slowing down of coal mining doesn't exist in as powerful a way. So kind of that self-interest aspect of it and the particular physical manifestation and difference between these two cases is absolutely a huge part of it.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for sharing all these case studies. I have a question shortly. So localism and nimbalism, and where is the fine line between? So maybe the local activities or activism is bringing benefits to the local community, but sometimes at the expense of other communities. So your stories about Los Angeles reminds me of story of Beijing, where I surely lived for a while. Same problem, same geological configurations. Then people protested, not like outwardly, but on social media. And the government made choices to move the industries outside of Beijing, but that resulted in moving the source of pollution outside of Beijing and to the places where they don't have a voice, so to say. And what we can see about environmental movement, sometimes it's tied with the kind of like not in my backyard nimbalism, and usually the more affluent communities or communities with more economic and political resources would easily or more able to provide to have a local solution, but the less. And how should we think around that kind of situations?
This is a superb question. So I think the question was, what is the connection between localism and NIMBYism, defined as not in my backyardism, which if I could summarize in 2 sentences or so is, you know, you don't like the polluting facility in your area, so you say, get it out, get it out, get it out, and then it ends up somewhere, you know, else, but you don't really think about the somewhere else. You're only interested in your locality. I think localism can very often be tied to NIMBYism. I'm from California. There's a lot of NIMBYism that goes on, as you say, in affluent communities that have the political connections to stop a project. And then what ends up happening is the project often goes somewhere else. What I would say is that localism, to me, is a neutral technology, I guess. It's a neutral tactic. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to convey in this book. And that's why in the end, in sort of a kind of jokey way, I said, this is not a romantic book. This is not a book that said local is awesome in all circumstances, rah, rah, rah. There's a lot of local is awesome examples in this book, but I also have some local is not so beautiful in this book. I've got a chapter in this book about Appalachia and medical care in Appalachia, where local elites who basically control the entire edifice of the county, the court, the public health department, other social service agencies basically took federal grant money and then just kind of used it to enrich themselves in incredibly crass ways. That's an example of bad localism, or localism used to bad ends. If you know about the history of Jim Crow in this country, what generally happened was the money would shoot down and then kind of local elites would use it in discriminatory ways backed by backed by the Supreme Court, affirming segregation. So localism very much, whether it's NIMBYism or any other kind of IMBYism, can be used both to affirm it and also to combat it. And so I think the lesson is to register that this tool you have in your hand can also be used and wielded by people of all kinds of ideological persuasions. It's ultimately not the tool I'm arguing for, localism. I'm not arguing that we always use localism in every single circumstance. I'm actually arguing that we should see localism in context. And those contexts can be towards what most of us in this room would call progressive ends. It can also be used in what most of us in this room would call regressive ends.
Hey, any other questions? One over here.
So I just wanted to ask, I'm kind of newer to a lot of the field and topics you're talking about. I'm a student in medical school, and I've come across this book, and it's called Big Med, and it's about mega providers and high cost marketing healthcare. Yeah. And I just was curious if that idea of kind of this shift to consolidation is something that you looked at, because that to me, from the outside looking in, seems very representative of like a national or big corporate kind of push versus this local and like community hospital shift that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's a good question. So my study sort of ends right when consolidation, as we know it, sort of starts. I think I kind of get in some of the other parts of the book into the seeds of that. One of the major configurations that everybody knows about in American healthcare is the relationship between universities and public hospitals. There are very few public hospitals, with some exceptions, but very few public hospitals in the United States that are pure public hospitals. Most of them are co-run in some way with a major university. For example, in Los Angeles, the big county hospital is called not County Hospital, but County USC. And so I think this is kind of the seeds of one form, and only one form of many forms of institutional consolidation. Now, I don't necessarily think, the right way to approach that is thumbs up, thumbs down, good, bad, right? It's I sort of end right when it really kind of starts in a kind of qualitatively new way, but it is something I've been thinking about a lot. Like if I were to write a sequel, that is definitely something that is absolutely unavoidable. And it's really started to accelerate in the 21st century. I mean, you see it just sticking to New York City. So many hospitals that were once part of other systems have now been gobbled up by even bigger systems. Is that good? Is that bad? I mean, it depends on your definition of good and bad, but it's certainly something that I think makes me actually question whether the local approach that some of the actors that I studied is as easily transferable into our current era, because they're in a just very different context than back then. Yeah.
And if I can I ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
And I actually think that kind of response segued well into it, because I was going to ask you a little bit about this initiative at the OEO. And how that came to be. And I think that it seems very community oriented. And if I'm understanding our presentation today correctly, that it was largely a success in the long term, despite many struggles for the community. So if we're today in our contemporary day and age looking to see how we can really kind of find these maybe federal support, but for more community-based initiatives, how did that happen? And where was the real push to make that happen back then, when I feel like there's not anyone with maybe that sort of incentive in government or incentive in terms of a position of power to really want to put that power in the community's hands for something like a healthcare system?
No, this is an excellent question. I think there's a couple things there. So one, where did the OEO program kind of come from? And then today, is there a way to kind of channel resources so that lay people actually have a say in the programs that affect them? So I will say that I think this is overall an incredibly positive story. I think the typical disposition of academics like me is to relentlessly dismiss everything as a minor dent in the overall repressive social order. But I have a very, very warm and soft spot for community health centers. I think this program worked, and I think it is a shining example of where kind of government spending actually does a lot of good. I think the big problem with it is that it's just not scaled up enough. There's like 1,000 plus, they're called FQHCs, federally qualified health centers. There's like 1,000 of them in this country, and then there's a few more thousand of ones that aren't funded by the government, but are funded by philanthropies or local governments and things like that. But the problem with them is that they're just not scaled. There's just not enough of them. But I think it's a very successful program. Why did it happen? I think a number of things. One is just the milieu. So from 1964 to 1966, you have an incredibly active Democratic Congress and Democratic administration. And this is a Congress that has been written about a lot because it just passes a flurry of incredibly highly consequential legislation, most famously Medicaid and Medicare, but other stuff like Head Start and things like that. So this is just kind of part of the milieu and zeitgeist of, yeah, let's try that. Boom. And thankfully, we still kind of have the program, even with all the political changes that have gone on since that. What can be done to sort of encourage more things like that? It's sort of interesting. So community health centers are also in a lot of red states. It's not just a blue state thing.
South Carolina.
So yeah. I mean, they create jobs, they're well-paying jobs, and just kind of not forget like social justice sort of stuff. And I mean, just on that kind of level, it can appeal. So I think that's one way to sort of sell it. I think the community participation stuff is a little harder. I kind of see both it ebbs and flows how interested governments are in actually wanting that. But also one of the arguments I made both in this presentation and in the book is that, be careful what you wish for, right? Community participation is one thing to demand. It's another thing to put in actual practice. And the actual practice is incredibly hard. It requires incredibly skilled community organizers who know how to interface with, angry people who have grievances, people who think they should be on the community board, etc. So I think that is still quite difficult. But I think there's lots of examples of community health centers in this city and in the country that offer some models. The problem is scale. How do you replicate those, models here and there?
Okay, all right. Well, please join me in thanking Merlin Chowkwanyun for their important work. And thank you all for your really great questions. We hope to see you again in December.
Thanks a lot.